So, as of recording this right now, we're just a few short months away from PlayStation 5, and I think it's a really great time to reflect on this generation, and PS4 specifically. It really is incredible when you look back at everything. You start to realize just how important the PS4 legacy is to Sony's lineup of consoles. Here's why. The thing of it is, we really have to put this into context from the 7th generation to the 8th. We all know the story of the PS3, a console that by and large had countless missteps during its development and launch. The following 7 years we saw Sony improve the console over time, and finally matching and even exceeding the Xbox 360 in sales. Of course it wasn't by much, but it was still incredible to see after 7 years, Sony finally having their product match their closest competitor. They didn't accomplish this by standing by idly. There were a lot of calculated efforts to improve the PS3. And when you're working tirelessly to improve your product that missed the mark, you have to know your next one needs to make some serious, much-needed changes. And that's the PlayStation 4. And think about it, Sony's walking into a generation where it's more of a level playing field. There's a lot of pressure for PS4 to deliver. So you can imagine the surprise come February 2013 when we see the announcement of the console, where it featured a radically redesigned controller. This might not sound all too meaningful, but we do have to keep in mind the DualShock was largely unchanged across 3 console generations for 19 years. Outside of the Boomerang controller for PS3, which never saw the light of day, Sony was pretty conservative with their controllers. The DualShock 4 was a complete departure, sporting a new shell, a light bar, new analog sticks, triggers that actually felt like triggers, a touchpad, a dedicated button for capturing gameplay. It really was a step in a new direction. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. The PS4's general makeup was a far cry from the last console, where PS3 utilized an asymmetric, multi-threaded exotic architecture called the Cell Processor. PS4 would be based on x86, an established architecture with more than 30 years of history attached to it. This meant developers no longer had to fuss around with a new instruction set to start developing software for the console. But see, it goes beyond that. The PS2 also had an obtuse work environment. It's just that PS3 was even worse. So we're talking over 10 years of developers messing around with Sony's insistence on exotic architectures. This was largely due to Ken Kutaragi, known as the father of PlayStation. He was the system architect for all 3 systems, but in 2007 he officially stepped down to honorary chairman, letting the next project, PlayStation 4, be helmed by somebody else. This is where Mark Cerny comes in, an industry veteran with almost 30 years of experience at the time. He worked at Atari, Sega, Crystal Dynamics, then went to Universal Interactive, to then doing consultation work for Sony, creating game engines, or working directly on Sony's upcoming games like Jak and Daxter, for example. This would be the case long-term for Mark, as he builds a close relationship with the company for years, working on hardware and software. It's around 2008 where Sony and Mark begin evaluating the problems of PS3, and Mark personally researching the x86 architecture on his own time. This is when he nominated himself as the lead hardware architect for PS4, and Sony actually agreed. This was a huge shift for the company, as an American never had the opportunity to lead the hardware project before, and this is why x86 was chosen. Cerny realized it could be embraced in a console, and this is what led the new principles at PlayStation. Talk with developers directly and ask them what they want. A lot of what the PlayStation 4 is today was decided by the very developers responsible for making your games, first party, second, and third. The overall attitude, approach, and design for this platform changed completely. Shahid Ahmad, who is the director of strategic content at PlayStation and was with the company for a decade before leaving in 2015, said, "We'd been through the fire with PS3 and now everything was on the line. We had to get this right, and if we didn't, it could have been the end." You remember the hubris from the PS3 years? Contrast that with the honesty and self-deprecation of the PS4 launch period, and you can see that the organization had become transformed to people who were now humble, passionate, and excited about this new thing. Battle-worn, but ready to serve again. That they did. The console launch was such an important period. I don't think any will forget E3 2013 when Sony set forth a very comfortable $399 price tag, finally putting behind their high-priced PS3 years, but also going out of their way to set the record straight that the company would not employ any sort of used game policies or require a constant internet connection to validate game purchases. Something Microsoft initially outlined for Xbox One, only to then be put in a very tough spot and then forced to remove it before launch. While Sony was surely evaluating some kind of DRM for their console behind the scenes or in early development, it's still so important that they ended up making it a point publicly that there would be no invasive measures. This wasn't just a win for PlayStation, but also the resulting Xbox One as well.
For instance, PlayStation 4 won't impose any new restrictions on the use of PS4 games. They can trade in the game at retail, sell it to another person, lend it to a friend, or keep it forever. PlayStation 4 disc-based games don't need to be connected online to play. If you enjoy playing single-player games offline, PS4 won't require you to check in online periodically. And it won't stop working if you haven't authenticated within 24 hours.
I'm very proud to announce that PlayStation 4 will be available at $399.
Now, of course, what kind of conversation would this really be if we didn't talk about the games? And so, as a visual, I laid out a bunch of games here to talk about, and not only is this not everything, but there's too many games here to really go over individually. I mean, it really goes into the end of PS3's life cycle, where if it wasn't obvious back then, it certainly is now for Sony's reputation for being committed to putting out exclusive games. So much so that people think it's just these high-caliber, big-budget, AAA, narrative-driven experiences, but really it's a broad range of genres, topics, ideas, smaller-scale games, more niche games that don't appeal to a wide audience, but we'll run through some of these, right? Established IP from the PlayStation 3 years that have made their way over to PS4 for some sequels, and these are fantastic because they're established. But then you see new IP, and these are always scary to fund for a big publisher, but we see Sony let their teams do these things, or just explore different ideas with established IP, like God of War. This is actually the only copy I have of the game. I gotta get a regular edition that's not the Steelbook. Then we see them do more polarizing things, like allowing Days Gone. Now, Days Gone was actually a very good game. Didn't hit the mark completely for everybody, but it's something where they will let those titles be funded alongside things like Last of Us Part 2. We also had, like, Drive Club and Gran Turismo Sport. That was, for a lot of people, I think, a little confusing at the time because there is a conflict of interest there, and then, unfortunately, Evolution Studios shut down. But also Last of Us Part 2 itself, a very divisive game, but one that Sony said, if this is what you want to put out, go ahead and do it. Towards the end of the life cycle, Ghost of Tsushima. Also, I don't know if I just showed this Spider-Man. I mean, they just nailed it with that. And then we've got other exclusives again. These titles may not be for everybody. This is Mark Cerny's game. Little Big Planet 3, kind of not the best Little Big Planet. We got a Knack 2. The Order 1886, another game that missed the mark. But Bloodborne, that speaks for itself. Until Dawn, Detroit Become Human, Death Stranding. Again, there's a running theme there, but then you've got the smaller stuff, important stuff, like seeing Shadow of the Colossus come back in a big way. Wonderful remake. Smaller Uncharted The Lost Legacy, Everybody's Golf. Great to see that this still shows up. Concrete Genie, definitely one of those smaller niche titles that is not for everybody. The Medieval remake. Again, this wasn't even everything. There's other games that I could have really pulled off here, but there's just so much. It really is a matter of if one of these games doesn't work for you, chances are there's another game that does. And that's the model of consoles, putting out exclusives that make you say, I have to buy a PlayStation 4 if I want to play some of these games. And there's really a whole other library of games that we're actually totally ignoring here when it comes to PlayStation 4. That's right, how can we not talk about PlayStation VR? Sony has had their fair share of peripherals over the years, from SingStar mics to the iToy, PlayStation Eye, PS Move, but this is the very first genuine extension beyond traditional play. The PlayStation Magic Lab had been working on virtual reality as early as 2010, and PS4 was the console ready to deliver. While the adoption of VR has been underperforming and relatively slow going, that doesn't have to undermine the experiences we're seeing. Some of the most thrilling and certainly the most immersive games are on PlayStation VR. It's an entire platform by itself with its own library of unique games. Despite the infancy of VR and the more technical shortcomings of PSVR itself, Sony has been extremely dedicated to the medium, and it's one we'll see capitalized on further with PlayStation 5. Now, in the same year that PSVR launched, we also saw PlayStation 4 Pro, a mid-cycle update with a spec bump to push higher resolutions and frame rates. Initially, this was seen as a foreign concept, and partly it is. Consoles don't often see spec bumps outside of their generational leaps, so for many this seemed like an odd decision. The end result, though, was harmony amongst options, a proof of concept for the scalability of games much like shipping a title on PC. The understanding that both PS4 and PS4 Pro are just that, both PlayStation 4s. You don't have to upgrade, but if you do, you can take advantage of those beautiful high resolutions offered on some of the best looking games we've seen this generation. And PS4 wasn't alone in this respect. Xbox One X also came along the following year. These initiatives were fairly successful from a game standpoint because of those x86 architectures, paving the way for next gen where we're still seeing ease of development being a top priority, but also securing backwards compatibility since the new consoles share similar logic with the outgoing ones. And then there's PlayStation Now. This might not be very exciting on the surface, but this is an important hallmark of PS4. This generation was Sony's introduction to game streaming, and an early one at that. It's still considered early to humor the idea that we should be streaming our games because no one wants to actually do that, nor is it even really possible for millions of households with poor internet. But we're seeing a running theme here. The PS4 represents a Sony that is 1. Ready to change and adapt, but 2. Be ahead of the game. So much so that PS Now has turned into less about the 500 plus streamable PS3 games and more about the 300 plus PS4 games that are now downloadable with an active subscription. Streaming is an option and likely one that Sony will continue to push and iterate on until the market transition takes place, but in the meantime, you've got a good value proposition in the downloadable games alone. It's not the same push as Xbox Game Pass, and that's okay based on Sony's current model of big budget games selling so well at a full price tag, but at a certain point, PS Now might make more sense than one would think. Only time will tell though. Of course, not everything was perfect with PS4. This is the generation we saw Sony require a PS Plus subscription to play online games, barring free-to-play, and while it can be a fantastic value of sales and monthly freebies, it's still a requirement that less engaged users don't want to have to pay. We then saw Sony slip into a level of arrogance by denying cross-network play, and depending on your personal preference, you might have been okay with this, but for a lot of consumers, it was important to have this option available so they could play with their friends regardless of platform. Also, this isn't so much of a bad thing, just that it fits more appropriately here. We saw PS4 and Vita developed in tandem. From the very onset, these devices were made to live together, with remote play being one of the headlining features for PS4 games and PS Vita ownership. This feature, for the most part, delivered, and we even saw a lot of cross-play and cross-buy games. It's just disappointing PS Vita itself was an all-around failure. Nowadays, the idea of remote play is your smartphone, rather than a dedicated Sony handheld. But when looking at everything, you start to see just how important and impactful the PS4 is in the lineup of PlayStation consoles. This was the company taking a step back and remembering what makes PlayStation great. This console saw amazing games, VR, streaming, a mid-cycle update. It broke a lot of new ground. And for Sony's renewed focus, it bodes well for the PS5's future. Now, maybe this is just me, but I almost feel like well into the PS5 lifecycle, PS4 won't be as loved and revered as something like PS3, where that console, almost out of necessity, had to have that factor around it, because unless you're streaming games or playing them via our PCS3, you're probably playing PS3 games on a PS3. Granted, the console also has a super cool history, and that's Sony's low point, and there's a lot of things to, have reverence around that system, but going into PS5, we have the luxury of playing most PS4 games right off the bat, and so that element alone really lowers the need to play on PlayStation 4 hardware specifically. And so despite this amazing legacy that the console actually is adding to Sony's lineup here, I don't know, part of me feels like it might not be as appreciated down the road, but realistically only time will tell. I mean, still, there's a lot of PS4s out there, and I'm sure a lot of people will continue to play on that platform specifically before upgrading to PS5, so but we'll see. Either way, though, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't yet, of course, please subscribe for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter @MysticRyan, and that is it. I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.